Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started in a few minutes and give folks time to join. Welcome to today's Free Alex Saab, U.S. Canada Hands Off Venezuela Picket action. There is interpretation available, and I will announce that in a second. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 31st consecutive. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the monthly picket action for Free Alex Saab, U.S. Canada Hands Off Venezuela. We are here united our voices today to demand freedom for Alex Saab, a Venezuelan diplomat held in U.S. jail, as well as an end to all sanctions against Venezuela by the United States, Canada, and their allies. Today, this webinar is being broadcast from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, the traditional and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish Coast Salish nations. I encourage people to post in the chat where you're joining from today. The chat is open and available to all, and to let us know your thoughts as we go through the 31st consecutive monthly picket action. My name is Allison Bodine. I am the coordinator of the Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, as well as author of the book Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Venezuela, which is from Battle of Ideas Press, and we'll put the information in the chat. And really honored to be here for the 31st month, uniting our voices from Venezuela to the United States to many different other countries around the world for these just causes at a critical time, which has been especially highlighted by this week's proceedings at the United Nations in New York. Before I go any further, I did want to make sure people know that there is interpretation available for tonight. If you are listening in English and that is the language you want to keep listening in, go to the bottom of your screen and click the interpretation button. It might be under the 3 dots under More, and you will be able to select the English channel to ensure you can keep listening in English during presentations when people are speaking in Spanish. Y si quieren participar en el idioma castellano de español, vamos a poner las instrucciones para interpretación en el chat. Y hay interpretación disponible. Gracias. Especialmente a Julieta y Mercedes por su ayuda hoy. Thank you to Julieta and Mercedes for your help with translation today. And again, please look in the chat for instructions. So, as I was saying, today we are gathered for the monthly picket action and an important time in our struggle against sanctions, blockades, and for freedom for Alex Saab. At the United Nations this week, the Foreign Minister of Venezuela, Iván Gil, addressed the United Nations General Assembly on September 23rd. He described the impact of the cruel US blockade and sanctions on Venezuela, stating, "These illegal measures have caused great pain and suffering for our people, with economic losses amounting to over 232 billion, a steep drop in our GDP, and the confiscation of billions of dollars in sovereign resources held in the international financial system, including 31 tons of gold seized by the British government in the Bank of England." In his address, Minister Gill also called for the immediate release of Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab, who has been held in US jail since October 2021, asserting that, quote, "This type of persecution jeopardizes the security and integrity of all diplomatic envoys worldwide, regardless of their nationality. From the UN, we call on all countries to reject this nefarious practice." So that's just some of the reasons why we are here today, standing up for the sovereignty and self-determination of Venezuela, because Minister Gill's words are a call to action. Before we go into our excellent panel tonight, featuring INDHRIANA Parada of the Free Alex Saab Movement in Venezuela, FELIPE VANEGAS from the National Directorate of the Unión Comunera, the Union of Communes in Venezuela, and Leonardo Flores, an analyst on U.S. Venezuela relations based in Washington, D.C., I wanted to just share a short video that includes the words of Iván Gil and explains some of his talk, which was focused on this criminal and cruel impact of U.S. sanctions.
Las mal llamadas sanciones, violatorias de toda norma del derecho internacional y de los propósitos y principios consagrados en la Carta de Naciones Unidas, constituyen violaciones a los derechos humanos de millones de personas y son aplicadas precisamente por quienes luego pretenden presentarse como paladines en la defensa de los derechos humanos. Son, además, un ataque deliberado contra el derecho al desarrollo de pueblos enteros y un impedimento para la consecución de la Agenda 2030 de la que tanto hemos hablado durante esta semana. Estas ilegales medidas han creado una crisis en el sistema de relaciones internacionales, por lo que exigimos su levantamiento total, inmediato e incondicional. Es inaceptable para nuestros pueblos que resisten día a día los efectos de una política criminal de bloqueo que esta Asamblea General pretenda desconocer en sus documentos políticos tal oprobio.
So that was a short video coming from the Anti-Blockade Observatory, which I hope at a future action we will have more to talk about when it comes to that important project based in Venezuela and run by Venezuela's anti-blockade minister, William Castillo. But that was what I wanted to share with everyone today as we welcome INDHRIANA Parada, who is a Venezuelan lawyer, an expert in human rights, and a member of the Free Alex Saab movement. I would say a leader for freedom for Alex Saab in Venezuela, which the Free Alex Saab movement is a constant organizer, constant voice for the liberty of Alex Saab, for justice, for human rights, and has really been such an example for all of us working in the United States and Canada and around the world for his freedom. INDHRIANA is author of the book, The Kidnapping of Alex Saab, a legal analysis, and continues to be really a leading expert on his case, the necessity is for his freedom, and kind of the next steps. So thank you, INDHRIANA, for making the time to be with us tonight. It's really good to see you.
Hola Alison, muy buenas noches desde Venezuela, un fuerte abrazo, un saludo a todos los compañeros de solidaridad de Canadá y de Estados Unidos que siempre nos acompañan y están ahí presentes en esta lucha por la soberanía e independencia y dignidad de los venezolanos. Muchísimas gracias. Sí, Alison, bueno, quería iniciar la intervención recordando la última acción mensual que ustedes tuvieron, en donde los acompañó nuestra querida compañera, líder del movimiento, Camila Saab, en esa acción que fue también un homenaje a nuestro querido profesor Luis Acuña. Recordar un poco las palabras de Camila en esa intervención cuando ella hacía una denuncia importante respecto al caso del diplomático Alex Saab y calificó el proceso legal o el proceso judicial que en este momento se lleva a cabo en Estados Unidos como una verdadera tortura judicial. Y yo creo que no hay mejor calificativo para mencionar en qué estado se encuentra ahora el proceso antijurídico, diríamos así, en el que está siendo sometido nuestro diplomático Alex Saab. Es importante decir, Alison, que esta denuncia de las diferentes torturas a las que está siendo sometido nuestro diplomático ya la venía haciendo los movimientos desde el primer momento de su detención arbitraria. Sin embargo, es importante decir que ya se venía denunciando que los procesos judiciales o los procesos que se están llevando a cabo dentro de los tribunales de los Estados Unidos están siendo dilatados, están siendo retardados al punto de violar entonces los propios derechos procesales, lo que es el debido proceso, sus derechos fundamentales, las garantías de un juicio justo. Y esto lo decimos así, Alison, porque ya hace más de un año, ya el libro al cual te referías, el libro del secuestro de Alex Saab, análisis jurídico, que es donde se hace un compendio de todo el análisis jurídico y los argumentos que tenía o que tiene Estados Unidos para supuestamente imputar a un diplomático venezolano, pero que aquí se desmonta cada uno de esos argumentos y se demuestra que es un verdadero proceso político. Y hago referencia al libro que ya va a cumplir casi un año de haber sido publicado, y ya ahí el movimiento Free Alex Saab hacía la denuncia que el diplomático estaba siendo sometido a una tortura judicial. Ahora, ¿a qué nos referimos nosotros con una tortura judicial, Alison? Es importante contextualizar esto, porque no es más que servirse de un aparente proceso jurídico para dentro del mismo violar todos los derechos humanos fundamentales, como está ocurriendo en este caso con el diplomático Alex Saab. Muy parecido a lo que nosotros llamamos un lawfare. Se sirven de un aparente proceso jurídico para darle un matiz de legalidad, pero realmente dentro del mismo proceso le están violando los derechos humanos. Debemos recordar que no solamente es el retardo procesal. Desde el inicio de la detención arbitraria, se han llevado a cabo una serie de actos.
There have been legal acts that are going against fundamental human rights for our diplomat. For example, I can give you an example. Recently, there was a new extension within the second instance court that was announced. And when Camila Fabri denounced this, there was a third extension, and now there's a fourth extension that was approved. So this process that we have been raising ever since it started in 2021 has been going on for over 2 years. We are trying to see if the United States is going to respect Alex's international protection, since he's a special envoy by the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. So this is a complaint that the movement has been doing for so long. And actually in page 72 of the book, you can all download this book for free in our Free Alex Saab Movement .org. There in the document section, you can download this book, and also the book that compiles Alex Saab's letters, and you can also download all the documents and arguments that the movement has brought to light to prove that our diplomat is a true political prisoner, and that then the Vienna Convention is being infringed with his detention. So in page 72, there's a description of all the tortures that Alex Saab is undergoing and has been undergoing ever since he was in Cape Verde. And we had warned of legal torture. So it's not only about the procedural backlog, but we must remember that when we mention the health condition of our diplomat in Cape Verde, let's remember that in July 2021, the Cape Verde court, when they saw the serious condition that Alex Saab was undergoing in terms of his health, because he is a survivor of stomach cancer, when they saw his health condition, they issued a note that said that he had to be transferred to Praia so that he could be seen by doctors because he was not receiving appropriate assistance. That decision was never complied with. The diplomat was kidnapped once again. He was taken to the United States, and that decision was not complied with. So it's not only about procedural backlog or delays, but actually any favorable decision for our diplomat are never complied with, and what we see in the United States is a constant extension and a constant delay of the process. And what we say is that this goes against the well-being and the health of our diplomat. So in summary, as regards to tortures, we can say that in Cape Verde, there were physical tortures and the due process was violated, and the decision issued by the Western African countries' decision was violated as well. So these were mainly physical tortures by the United States, and then we see that in the United States, the psychological tortures continue and the legal tortures continue. These are a violation of fundamental human rights masked by an apparent legal framework. Also, we see with a lot of concern the non-independence of the judges. In this case, we can speak of Judge Robert Scola in the United States, who
con argumentos políticos, cuyos argumentos también fueron recogidos en el libro antes de haber emitido la sentencia. ¿Por qué quiero hacer énfasis en esto?
So why do I want to emphasize on this? Because ever since our diplomat was detained, the United States used two main arguments to violate international law. First, they do not recognize President Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, and therefore they do not acknowledge the legitimacy of any of his officials. This is a very dangerous situation, not only for Alex Saab, who is a victim of this situation, but for all public officials, not only of Venezuela, but of any other country where the United States may refuse to acknowledge their government, and they can go against the legal security of the government officials. But also it's important to say that as part of these arguments that we discussed, on top of the lack of acknowledgement of President Maduro, they speak of a Venezuela that is allegedly a criminal, that there is a corrupt state, and they classify Venezuela as a criminal, not only the state of Venezuela, but also the Venezuelan people. So we continue proving that the arguments that the Free Alex Saab movement has been raising for over 3 years Well, we have been proved right by history and time. We have to remember Camila Fabre's words when the former President Donald Trump confessed that he used a plan, that it was his plan to try to bring Venezuela to a collapse. Well, Camila said that it's been proven that we were right, that we did not lie. So in this case, with these legal arguments regarding the legal torture that Alex Saab is undergoing and the violation of his fundamental rights, we are proving that we were right, that the public prosecutor's office has only proven to be using political arguments against international law, and that these arguments are never part of an international convention. However, the defense of Alex Saab continues to prove the illegality of his detention, and that Alex Saab is a special envoy by the Republic of Venezuela, and that his only crime was to go to try to put an end to the blockade, to try to get fuel, food, and medicine to bring them to Venezuela, not only amidst a cruel blockade imposed by the United States, but also amidst a world crisis after the pandemic. So we see that all this, as the Foreign Minister Ivan Gil denounced at the General Assembly of the United Nations, it constitutes a crime against the population of Venezuela. It constitutes a genocide as it is established in Article 6 of the Statute of Rome, because they wanted to bring the population of Venezuela to a condition where they could not make a living. So we insist on the fact that our diplomat, Alex Saab, is being subjected to a legal process that is not unbiased, at least as regards the decision that was issued by Robert Scola on December the 23rd with wrong arguments, and that this is about to turn 2 years, and that so far the Attorney General's office is asking for extensions to avoid submitting their arguments to respond to the arguments that were presented by the defense. And this is important to be highlighted. These continuous extensions are not only asked because they do not have the capacity to submit serious arguments. It's not only because it's hard to contradict the amici curiae, who also presented arguments in favor of Alex Saab. More than 6 friends of the court submitted written documents to defend Alex Saab. But on top of that, it's important to highlight that these continuous extensions have one target, one goal. When they were trying to make Alex Saab sign an extradition order, but these extensions have the goal to try to tire and to exhaust our diplomats, so that time goes by and he becomes tired, and so that he agrees to something that is common in the United States, which is to agree to say that he's guilty. So after 3 years of incarceration and torture has not been achieved. So there we see the bravery and the conviction, the moral and physical conviction of our diplomat. However, we know that time is against him, and as the lawyer said in the previous Picket action, she described a physical situation, the health that is very concerning. However, we know that these are the goals and the aim of asking for these continuous extensions, because they do not have a way to challenge the Convention of Vienna, which is very clear when it sets forth the requirements of what a diplomat is. So here from Venezuela, we continue to raise our voices. We continue to encourage all people to join our cause, because it's a Venezuelan cause, but not only that, it's a cause for human rights of a person, of a father, but also it's something for dignity, sovereignty, and the self-determination of the Venezuelan people. Us Venezuelans are the only people who are able to decide on what is the system that we want to implement. We Venezuelans are the only people who have the power to raise our voices against the empire's injustice. We see a state that is trying to use any political argument available to try to justify something that is clearly a violation to human rights and a violation to international law. So thank you very much, Alison from Venezuela. Thank you. Free Alex Saab.
Thank you very much, Idriana, for that update and emphasis on what we always say about the case of Alex Saab, and we must say again and again and repeat, which is that the case of Alex Saab is a political case. The legal component of it is so clearly unjust and falsified and trumped up and outside of international law, but also outside of, you know, so even basic human rights law, as far as the denial of family visits, the denial of visits to a doctor, the inability for Alex Saab to receive visits from Venezuelan consular staff, all of this coming from the United States. And as I mentioned, being highlighted also at the United Nations during the General Assembly, where I hope we will see you know, an increased effort and more people from around the world joining in, demanding Alex Saab's freedom. So thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate your continued work for the Free Alex Saab movement and for freedom for Alex Saab. Thank you all, and thank you to people in the chat as well for, of course, recognizing the absence of Professor Luis Acuña, who passed away after an illness just 1 month ago. Professor Luis Acuña was a fighter in Venezuela's diplomatic corps. He stood for freedom for Alex Saab, and when he passed was the charge d'affaires of the Venezuelan embassy here in Canada, but was living in Venezuela. So we definitely miss him and feel his absence at this monthly picket. Thank you for recognizing that. Next up, I believe we are connected with Felipe. Felipe, if you can hear me, I'm going to ask you to start your video and unmute.
Te escucho por ahí.
Sí, todo bien. Yes, we can hear you. Felipe.
Hola, te escucho.
Hola, sí. Felipe is joining us from the National Directorate of the Unión Comunera, the Union of Communes in Venezuela, which is a newly formed network of communes in Venezuela. Felipe is a coca producer with the Che Guevara Socialist Commune in the state of Mérida, Venezuela, and it is an honor to have you here to talk to us more about the impact of sanctions and blockade on Venezuela, but especially how people in Venezuela, the communes movement, are fighting back against this criminal blockade. Thank you, Felipe. It's very good to meet you and to see you.
Buenas noches.
Good evening. As I explained, we are producers of coffee and cocoa in the socialist Che Guevara Commune in this territory. And we are part of the national organization, the Union of Comuneros, Unión Comunera. It is an organization that is born in the midst of the blockade, in the midst of the pandemic as well. And it stems from the need of meeting in relation and resisting in relation to the economic and political difficulties. That it was founded in March 4th last year, and all of this has to do with the capitalization of the political process over the last 4 years. Different organizations of communes, we met along the way, along the path, and we got together because together, of course, we can be stronger. We can be stronger to resist the economic situations that we are facing at this moment.
¿Cómo nos ha
In relation particularly to the blockade, how it has affected us. It not only has to do with economic issues. From the people, from the popular field, we feel that we are the most affected, not only in relation to economics, but also in relation to health situations that we had been able to solve during the revolutionary process, during the year 2000 until 2015. Health, now we saw it strongly affected because we weren't able to import the necessary products to assist our health. So we saw comrades die of curable diseases because we were not able to buy the medicine for them, because we were not able to obtain the medicine, cancer fighting medicine. We had to see many people go in relation to this situation. And even though this is not an open war against American imperialism, we feel that we had more deaths even than in a military confrontation, because from the point of view of health in territories, it was one of the things that affected us the most, both politically and morally, in the loss of popularity of not being able to solve the situation of purchasing these products. And also, we saw a lack or loss of motivation because we saw our family members and friends die. And this has slowed down the revolutionary march in our country. And that is very terrible. And we see that with class-related hatred in relation to this situation.
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry, he was cut off.
Yes, I think he is coming back.
Hola, ¿me escuchan ahí?
Sí,
Can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you.
yes.
So, for example, in the agricultural field in our country, we are small-scale agriculture producers. It was complicated for us to obtain the necessary inputs for agriculture because many inputs could not be imported, the ones that we could not produce. So this also affected production, and this also generated needs in relation to food and nourishment in our country. This affected us greatly. The situation affected us in this sense. Also in the field of transportation, the transportation that we rely on to mobilize our production to the cities, we were also affected by the blockade. We weren't able to purchase inputs for transportation. So this paralyzed transportation in many cases because we didn't have the necessary auto parts for the transportation system. And what we were able to receive, it had very high prices. We had to purchase them from third parties, and we weren't able to do direct imports. All of this was affected our popular field because, of course, we are the most vulnerable portion of society. We are the most vulnerable part of society. In one way or the other, with a lot of political consciousness, we were able to resist all these years. We were able to stand by socialism, communal and Bolivarian socialism, as not only the hope of Venezuela, but it is also the hope of a better life for the world. And by stating that, we resisted these difficulties, we resisted these inconformities that our population has oftentimes because we are pressured. We are so pressured. So from the territory, we say to imperialism, if socialism does not work, then we don't need a blockade. If socialism were a failure, we wouldn't need a blockade. So please, We need to be able to do our territorial work. Please do not meddle with our national situation. Our people needs to be able to access the basic necessities in our territory. Imperialism shouldn't even meddle with us because this has to do with a human situation that we are living in our territories, an inhuman situation, I'm sorry, because if we could afford all our needs because we are a oil producing country, well then let us enter the international market. Let us enter the alleged free market of capitalism, which doesn't work the way they say it works. So from the popular movement, we do thousands of things to face the crisis. In several communes in the territory, because of devaluation generated by the blockade, we created communal currencies in order to generate exchanges in our territories. For example, in the commune of El Panal, which is one of the most well-known cases, they created a currency called El Panalito, which was a currency created in order to hinder inflation or support inflation. And also, Panalito solved these problems for a territory, for a communal territory. People could use a currency to exchange their goods and services. In our territory, the socialist Che Guevara Commune, we also created our own currency, created based on coffee. We were able to capitalize our bank in the commune, our functional bank, where our currency was called El Cafeto. This was an experience that lasted about 3 or 4 years during the strongest moment of the crisis and the strongest moment of inflation. And this currency conserved its value in relation to coffee, to one of people's needs, necessities. That's how we were able to store and accumulate a certain amount of resources. And with this, we were able to exchange between coffee producers and producers in other areas, taking into account that we had this currency that was called the cafeto, as I mentioned, and this allowed people to support the crisis at that time. It allowed people to have a way out from the movement itself, from the commune, to solve a difficult problem like inflation was in those very hard years of 2016 to 2018. At this moment, we had the impact of the blockade was very, very strong. And unfortunately, it not only impacted health, as I mentioned before, our people, a large part of our people were malnourished in our territories because we did not have the necessary food or the access to the different proteins and flours, because a large part of those products, as you know, were imported, or we import from abroad, because we are a small country and most of the population lives in large cities, and there is a smaller amount of population living in the rural areas. And so production in the rural areas was not enough to feed, and we had to produce without inputs because we couldn't access purchasing them from abroad. So this has to do with this is related to the capacity of consciousness, of awareness that our people in Venezuela have, and the legacy of Chavez. We believe that this is a different project, and if today we make the sacrifice of resisting this project for the future, it will be the future for humanity. It will be the future for all of us, and we are convinced completely that if the communal movement resists the next 20 or 30 years, in the upcoming years, the territorial governments will be spoken of much more. They will speak of the Venezuelan communes all over the world as an experience of socialism in the world. I'm going to leave it here. I haven't maybe spoken a lot, but I have done it from my heart, and I'm very moved. I wanted to tell you about what is going on in our country in relation to the crisis, and also in relation to imperialism that is asking for democracy in other countries, and it hungers us, it starves us, and it gives us misery in our countries. Long live Chavez, long live the revolution, long live the Venezuelan people. Thank you very much.
Viva Venezuela. Thank you very much, Felipe Vanegas, from the Unión de Comunes, the Communes Union in Venezuela. I will, in 1 minute, put in the chat some links where you can follow the work of the Unión Comunera and support them. There's also some campaigns related to how people in North America can support the communes movement. So I'll put that in the chat as well. And thank you for telling us directly how the criminal US blockade has impacted your community and your co-fighters. And that has given us such another important level of understanding of the necessity of our work to work harder to unite our voices against this criminal blockade, which, as Felipe said, is killing people in Venezuela, is an act of genocide against Venezuela, and is something that it is the US government and the government of Canada that are responsible for this, and people that are here in the United States and Canada, we have to work to really defeat these criminal sanctions and blockades. So thank you so much for your time, Felipe. Next in our panel for tonight, we do have Leonardo Flores, who is one of those people leading the struggle, trying to work together to figure out how we can build this stronger and more united movement against sanctions and blockades on Venezuela and for Alex Saab. Leo is joining us tonight from Washington, D.C., where he is an analyst on U.S. Venezuela relations. Leonardo was born in Venezuela and maintains close ties to social movements that have transformed the country over the past 20 years. And I'm really looking forward to your analysis and updates tonight, Leonardo. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you, Allison and the Fire this time, not just for the invitation, but for always keeping us so active and informed. I just got this in the mail today. I don't know if maybe it's a little blurry, but it's the Fire this time newspaper. I wanted to start off with a couple of things that have been in the news lately that you may have seen. First of all, 2 military operations that are going on in Venezuela. An 11,000 person strong military force recently took control of Tocorón prison, which is a prison in the state of Aragua, which is just to the west of Caracas. And this prison had become the base of operations for a transnational criminal organization called the Tren de Aragua that had really expanded regionally. And this is basically a cartel that was involved in drug trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, murder for hire, you name it. And so it was a big blow to organized crime in Venezuela that just took place.
1 second, Leonardo. Try and slow down a little bit. You've got plenty of time.
Yes, I'm actually an interpreter myself, and I know I should go slowly, so I apologize to the interpreters. I'll go more slowly.
Thank you.
So, and also Venezuela's military is continuing its operations in the Amazon. These began in June to expel organized criminal elements and illegal mining from national parks. So far, 12,000 miners have been evacuated. But the reaction we've seen by the mainstream media and by the Western foreign policy elite is really kind of another example of the double standard routinely applied to Venezuela. Because if it had taken no action in these cases, it would be accused of enabling organized crime and of destroying the environment. And we've seen these accusations particularly strongly over the past 10 years. But of course, when it does take action, now suddenly it's accused of human rights violations. So Venezuela really is in the eyes of kind of the Western foreign policy elite in this kind of lose-lose situation. But I also wanted to mention these because, these are 2 issues that have been a problem for several years. And the fact that the government is able to take action now can be interpreted as a sign of increased stability and security. I mean, I think one of the reasons they hadn't taken action before, particularly during the Trump years, is the overhanging threat of a possible invasion, which made it so that the military couldn't focus on anything other than protecting its borders, right? And now we're seeing some really important things take place in terms of fighting organized crime and really in taking down these illegal gold mining rings. In terms of kind of regional news, I think we've also seen in the news that Guyana has auctioned off offshore oil blocks to Exxon. And these are in waters that are actually disputed. And there's as we know, there's a border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana that actually dates back to before Guyana was a country, to the 1840s, when the British took over this piece of land from the Netherlands, and then the British kept steadily expanding the border westward when it had never been theirs, it had belonged to Venezuela. President Maduro has called for dialogue with Guyana, and actually what the Venezuela's position is that the controversy should be settled from the 1966 Geneva Accord, which was an agreement between the British and Venezuela just prior to Guyana becoming an independent country, to set up a mechanism through which this dispute would be settled peacefully. But in the meantime, Guyana has actually taken Venezuela to the International Court of Justice. So there's this kind of controversy there. But of course, what we're also seeing is US involvement and interference in this. I think the head of the Southern Command was actually in Guyana in June. And back in 2018, Exxon ships had to actually be chased away from the area by Venezuela's Navy. Furthermore, I think there's a lot of sentiment in Venezuela about this region, which we call the Essequibo. And actually, Venezuela's National Assembly has called for a referendum to ratify the defense of the nation's territorial sovereignty and integrity. In kind of better news among relations with neighboring countries, Venezuela and Trinidad have recently signed a deal over a shared natural gas field. And this deal had actually been held up for several months because the United States would not allow Trinidad to pay Venezuela for the natural gas. They would only allow swaps of food, which of course Venezuela rejected, because in part it doesn't really need food anymore, as we've seen, as we heard from Felipe, there's been an increased production of food in the country. But according to news reports, Trinidad's prime minister lobbied the US to soften its kind of no cash policy. And on the Venezuelan end, PDVSA, which is the state oil company, accepted part cash, part in-kind payments, in-kind being, it's not clear yet what it will be, but food, medicine, equipment, you name it, things other than cash. So this is really kind of a positive development in terms, not just economically for both those countries, but it's also a sign that the Biden administration is softening, particularly on the issue of natural gas, because of course, Europe is suffering from a shortage of natural gas due to the conflict in Ukraine. Earlier this month, President Maduro went on a week-long state visit to China, and one of the results of the trip is that it was announced that China and Venezuela relations are being upgraded to what's known as an all-weather strategic partnership. I think Venezuela has become one of only 3 countries that has such a relationship with China now. And there were 31 bilateral agreements signed during this week-long visit with deals on food exports, poverty alleviation, trade, energy, culture, science, and technology. This includes sending of Venezuela to China's forthcoming moon base. So that's really kind of exciting news as well. And just the other day, President Maduro announced a new social mission that it's going to be supported by China's International Poverty Reduction Center, and it's going to be called the Social Equality and Happiness Mission. As those of us who's followed Venezuela for years know, we know that it was the social missions that have transformed the country, whether it's, currently it's the Great Housing Mission is one of the biggest ones. And that's really brought better health and education and housing, among many other things, to the Venezuelan people. And so it's really important to see how this new mission is going to turn out, because as you might not know, but actually in 2013, when President Maduro was first running for office, one of his promises was to eliminate extreme poverty. And of course, that could not happen due to the repeated attempts by the right wing to overthrow the government. And then, of course, by the criminal sanctions imposed by the US and their allies. But with this new social mission, I think there is a strong possibility that Venezuela is going to be able to eliminate extreme poverty at some point in the future. I also want to talk a little bit, of course, about the US-Venezuela relationship, because we've seen several news reports saying that there have been ongoing talks between the two governments, but nothing concrete and no real details, except for recently at a DC think tank, the US ambassador to Colombia outlined the conditions that the US was setting for what they call temporary sanctions relief. And these were 5 conditions, which were setting a date for the elections, credible international observation, releasing political prisoners and opening civic spaces, lifting bans on participation, and updating the electoral registry. I think there's going to be room for negotiating and maneuvering on some of these points. Of course, though, what we really have to keep in mind is that the US isn't really interested in a free and fair election because Venezuela has had many of those. And every time that, Chavismo wins, which has been almost every time over the past 26, 28 elections, the US immediately, cries foul. And I also want to note that every time the Biden administration and their officials talk about sanctions relief, they also couch it in terms of it being temporary, implying that the outcome of the elections are going to affect whether the sanctions are reimposed. So really what the US seems to be trying to set a trap for Venezuela where it offers temporary sanctions relief. Then if Chavismo wins the elections, which is, it looks like a very distinct possibility, of course, if not a probability, but those are about a year away, a year and change, then they'll reimpose the sanctions. And we've seen the United States kind of do this in the past. So it's kind of something to keep an eye on, but maybe not quite, and not be super hopeful about those possibilities yet. Especially because we're seeing increased pressure in the Senate to maintain pressure on Venezuela. Last August, we had 18 senators, including 12 Democrats, sign a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken in support of the opposition primaries and saying that the winner, quote, must be allowed to run in the general election in a legitimate election that credible international election observers confirm represents the will of the Venezuelan people, unquote. So already we're seeing the United States interfere in the Venezuela's elections, as they've tried to interfere in every election in the past 2 decades. And what's really curious is that many of these senators who are saying that, everyone who wants to run should be allowed to run are also saying that former President Donald Trump should not be allowed to run in the US elections. So this is a case of what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander. I shouldn't have used an idiom, apologies to the interpreters, but basically it's another double standard where they're saying that Trump, because of his attempted coup, shouldn't be allowed to run, but people like Maria Corina Machado, who also is involved in several coup attempts and who was called for an invasion of Venezuela and who was called for more and more sanctions against Venezuela, she should be allowed to run with no problem. But on the plus side, we're seeing a bit of pushback against this from the House of Representatives because the delegation from the Congressional Progressive Caucus recently visited Colombia, Brazil, and Chile. This is a delegation that includes AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, among others. And on their return, they've actually been much better on the issue of sanctions as a main driver of Venezuelan migration. So now that's starting to creep into the discourse and people are starting to understand that sanctions really are one of the main things that's pushing Venezuelans out of the country, particularly since the Trump sanctions of 2017. And more good news is that US Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, is under indictment for the second time. And as a result, he was forced to step down as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is really big because Menendez is a very powerful Democrat. And with the Senate in such basically an even split between Democrats and Republicans, Menendez was really kind of a key piece in keeping all the sanctions on Cuba in place and also in increasing the pressure on Venezuela. In fact, Menendez had said that he was going to introduce, over the summer, he said he was going to introduce a bill called the Venezuela Emergency Relief, Democracy Assistance and Development Act, so-called, quote unquote, the Verdad Act. And this bill would have codified the bounty imposed by the State Department on President Maduro, or the Treasury Department, excuse me. It would have codified the sanctions on the petro, Venezuela's digital currency, and it would have ratified executive orders on Venezuela's debt and gold sector. So basically, it would have codified sanctions and made it a lot more difficult for a political agreement between the US and Venezuela to result in a lifting of sanctions. And we're still seeing also several other bills in Congress that are going to do similar things, but without Menendez, it's not clear how quickly these are going to move through. So that's a big plus. And in terms of Menendez, for those of you who live in the United States, there really is a lot of pressure right now on him to resign. So if you live in the US, please call your senators and ask them to call for Menendez's resignation on the basis of corruption. Because if he's out of the Senate, I think there is going to be space for positive action on Venezuela and Cuba. Two countries that we hold dear at heart. Finally, I think next month we're actually having a advocacy day in Congress, a group of organizations dedicated to anti-sanctions work, and I'll make sure Allison gets all the information, of course, so she can share it with you all. But we're going to be lobbying against some of these bills, including the the Senate 995 Venezuela Democracy Act, which seeks to impose a transition government and restore the National Assembly elected in 2015. This is how backward some of these senators are. You know, they're talking about reimposing a National Assembly that was elected 8 years ago, despite the fact that in 2020, there were already new National Assembly elections. So it's a very kind of mixed bag in terms of the prospects for improvement in Venezuela-US relations, and particularly for improvement in sanctions relief. But, you know, I think there's still hope out there, and we have to really keep up the fight. And I really want to thank you again, Allison, for the invite and for all the great organizing you all are doing.
Thank you, Leonardo. Speaking from the very belly of the beast, I agree. There's, you know, some important openings that we have to be able to take advantage of. And I am sure that we'll hear more about the lobbying day and hopefully be able to create kind of a social media campaign around it as best we can to support work happening in Washington, D.C. Appreciate all the various updates and analysis. As we know, there's a near blackout on media around Venezuela in the United States and Canada as well. You know, any media coverage is distorted, is manipulated, is against the Bolivarian government of President Nicolas Maduro, but it's also not very much coverage in general. And so we hear very little about anything related to what you said. And that goes the same here in Canada, and really helps us to understand I think the depth of US interference in Venezuela. I mean, we're talking about an election, and it's going to be a very important time for us to continue organizing and talking. And as we get closer, we'll talk more about elections in Venezuela, but already the United States is through its back channels and Colombian diplomats saying this is what Venezuela needs to do in order to get some sanctions relief, when Venezuela has one of the most powerful and airtight election systems in the world, as recognized by former US President Jimmy Carter, among others. And so we really have to highlight some of the things you've said, and especially the hypocrisy of the United States. So thank you. And thank you. Some folks are sharing some interesting things in the chat related. And I did want to also invite you, Leonardo, if you'd like to share. I know you're helping with a fundraising campaign for Embarlovento in Venezuela. If that's still running, then feel free to post the information in the chat for people to check out, or if you'd like to say a few words, but yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. If you don't mind, I could just briefly mention it. I'm actually trying to look up the link here. So we're actually doing a fundraiser for what's known as the Center for the Embarlovento Venezuela, which is a traditionally Afro-Venezuelan region. And so there's a center for comprehensive studies of Barlovento's culture and history, and they're raising funds to basically pay for teachers and pay for kids drumming lessons, drumming being one of the arts of the Barlovento community. And yeah, there it is. That's the link. Oh no, went to me. Thank you, Allison. I'll put it in the chat. So please, everyone, help us preserve Barlovento's culture. I don't know, I think many of you have met Chucho Garcia. He used to be the Consul General of Venezuela in New Orleans. He's one of the foremost authorities on the Venezuelan African diaspora. And we're raising funds for this think tank that's seeking to preserve Barlovento's culture.
Excellent. Yeah, so that is in the chat. And some other folks are writing some messages to you, so make sure to check that out and want to connect. And next, so that was the panel for tonight's 31st consecutive monthly picket action for free Alex Saab and US-Canada hands-off Venezuela. We have tonight greetings from a few different organizations and folks across Canada. And then we also do have a time that we take every month for a group photo. So encourage people to get ready as we get folks who are going to give greetings promoted. I will take a second to announce the Free Alex Saab postcard campaign. I know many people on this call have participated in the postcard campaign, received postcards and used them at summer festivals across the US and Canada, and got these in the mail to US President Biden. But this campaign was launched by the Fire This Time Venezuela Solidarity Campaign and the Anti-War Committee in Minnesota. And we've been working together to get them far and wide and flood the White House with postcards demanding freedom for Alex Saab. It's not only a campaign that puts pressure on the White House, it's also a way to approach people, to talk to people about the campaign. It's a political education campaign because it has information on the back about the case of Alex Saab. And we want to continue sending these far and wide. So I'll put in the chat information about how to join the postcard campaign. You can email fttvenezuelasolidarity@gmail.com and get your postcards, especially leading up to the date of the next trial. We wish it was sooner. We hope it gets pushed sooner, but for now is in June of 2024 for Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab. So for greetings, I want to welcome Andrew Barry. Andrew is here from an anti-war coalition here in Vancouver, Mobilization Against War and Occupation. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Allison. As an anti-war organizer in Canada, in a country that has been an imperialist power since its existence against poor and developing countries, that has worked side by side with Europe and the United States against Venezuela, Cuba, and many countries around the world that have come under the attack. I think it's important this week that also we note that in Iraq, it's been over 20 years since the US invasion of Iraq, and it has just been exposed that the United States has refused to enter any discussion about reparations to people in Iraq for the crimes against humanity, the war crimes that the United States government did against millions of people in Iraq. At least over 1 million people in Iraq have been killed by the US war. Also, hundreds of thousands, unknown amount of people have been killed by the US war in Afghanistan. 150,000 people have been killed by the US-backed war against the people of Yemen. The people in Palestine have been under a US-backed Israeli occupation for over 75 years of terror against the Palestinian people by Israel. And these same powers are the ones that want to lecture us. They want to lecture people around the world about human rights and decency. These are the same people that are now using sanctions and blockade against people in Venezuela and around the world, as they have been doing for many, many years. And it has been exposed also recently at the United Nations that the great divide, the wealth divide in the world of the Western countries against the developing world, is becoming more and more of a focal point and is being more and more openly discussed by countries that have been under sanctions, that have been impoverished by the imperial and colonial policies of countries like Canada, the United States, and Europe. And as these Western countries scramble, as they start to see a new world changing, where people are rising up across many parts of the world, from Niger in Africa to continued resistance in Cuba that has been under 60 years of US blockade, to Venezuela, which has gone for its independence for almost 25 years now and has never had a minute without a US attack, a US blockade, a US sanction against it, an attempted coup. It's been 25 years and people in Venezuela have resisted. They have resisted a lot of hardship. They've resisted a lot of attacks, a lot of terrorist attacks from the United States on infrastructure. They've imposed sanctions that continue to get stronger and stronger every day. And I think that over the last couple of years, we need to emphasize also the significance of these sanctions have increased incredibly under Joe Biden. They increased under Trump, Obama, Bush, but Biden has been the worst in imposing more sanctions on more people across the world, trying to create more starvation. As an anti-war organizer, we've seen a shift in policy from the imperial powers as they've become weakened and they no longer do direct wars and occupations as much as they used to. They're now using sanctions and starvation against people around the world. And it's people like Alex Saab who stand up against this, who have stood up against this and risked their entire life, risked their families' lives that have completely turned upside down to defend what is right and to defend people not only in Venezuela, but around the world against the war drive, sanctions, and the blockade from the United States, Canada, and Europe. Free Alex Saab, U.S. hands off Venezuela now.
Thank you, Andrew, for making those important connections and links. I agree. You know, there's been a lot of important interventions at the United Nations this week, and will continue to hopefully be an elevated level of discussion on the international level about the impact of sanctions and blockades. And it's important that we remember all of the countries that have faced the boot of the US imperialism and have continued to resist, including Venezuela. So thank you. Karen Rodman is also here from Just Peace Advocates, one of the organizations sponsoring the monthly pickets. Karen, a few words today.
Thanks, Allison. It's such an honor and a pleasure to join with you each month as you bring us together and keep the Samud steadfastness of looking at Venezuela and Alex Saab in particular. It's so important that it is ongoing and that we come together and have this place to join together. To the points that Andrew has just raised, I will also add Kashmir for 75 years of military occupation as well, and also just highlight Canada's involvement as the United Nations was formed in 1947, 1948, and taking leadership to position for what has become the situation in Palestine and Kashmir and other locations around the world over the last 75 years. That Canada very much played a key role at that time and has continued to through many different approaches through the years. So do raise that and free Alex Saab and hands off Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So we've now reached the time of our picket when we are ready for the group photo. I'm going to start inviting people to turn on their cameras and participate in the photo. If you have a sign, that's great. A t-shirt, that's great. If not, that's all right. Still, if you're in a position to turn on your camera, come join us in the group photo as we chant together. And as we do that, I also wanted to call attention to a tweet and kind of a part of an international campaign right now to defend Cuba. Cuba and Venezuela actually appeared in the United Nations in many events over the past week, have had a very successful visit to New York City. And in response to this success against blockades and sanctions and the criminal policies of the US government, the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. faced a terrorist attack. 2 Molotov cocktails were thrown at it just 2 nights ago. And Camila Fabri Saab, the wife of Venezuelan diplomat, political prisoner in the United States, Alex Saab, sent a very important tweet calling on all defenders of international law to defend the security of diplomats as they exercise their functions, including those, of course, inside of the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., and from the Free Alex Saab movement condemned the terrorist attack. We call for, as she said, the world's diplomats to be respected. So I'll put that tweet in the chat, and I encourage folks to send your messages of solidarity and support of the Cuban embassy at this important time. And I know many organizations present have released statements as well. From our part, the Fire This Time movement for social justice also joins this worldwide call in condemning this attack. Again, this has been the 31st consecutive monthly picket action for free Alex Saab and end sanctions on Venezuela. You should be receiving the invitation in the chat to join us as a panelist and turn on your cameras. I can say some people have started joining. If you haven't received the invitation and you'd like to join us, then raise your hand or type in the chat and I will try to find you. If you received the invitation more than once, my apologies. Sometimes things get a little mixed up back here, so feel free to decline it again if you have to, but join us, of course, if you can. I know folks are getting their signs and everything ready. It's really good to see you all. And also, if we could help, we'll eventually turn off translation and unmute ourselves. But before we do, I really want to give a big thank you to Julieta and Mercedes, who joined us tonight for interpretation and made this webinar fully bilingual. It's been a challenge through some rough internet connections, especially, so we really appreciate your hard work to help us make these as accessible as possible. Some folks still have their hands up. No worries. Your camera's not working. It's okay. Next time. But yes, if you haven't received the invitation to turn on your camera and you'd like to, again, put in the chat or raise your hand. Oh, we've got a few more hands here. Let's do this. This. Okay, and we'll go ahead and let me figure out the unmuting function here. So we can all chant together. There we go. So now we can all unmute and take our photo. Anna, you should have received the invitation. I don't know what's going on. Hopefully you'll get it.
Free Alex Saab.
Here we are. Free Alex Saab.
Free
Alex Saab. Free Alex Saab. Free Alex Saab.
Free Alex
Saab.
Hands off Venezuela.
Hands off Venezuela.
Hands off Venezuela. Free
Hands off Venezuela.
Free Alex Saab.
Free Alex
Saab.
Thank you again,
Alex Saab.
to Indriana, to Felipe, who did have to leave us. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining tonight. We'll see you at the 32nd monthly picket action 1 month from now at the end of October. Free Alex Saab.
Free Alex Saab.
Free Alex Saab.
Free Alex Saab. Hands off Venezuela.
Viva Venezuela.
Wow.
Free Alex Saab.
Free Alex.